The rain came down in silver sheets that Tuesday morning, drumming against the pavement with the kind of persistence that made ordinary people pull their collars up and walk faster. Isabella Grant stood in the parking garage of her own building, staring at the folded uniform in her hands, a faded navy jacket with the company logo on the chest pocket, a pair of worn khaki trousers, and a baseball cap that smelled faintly of cardboard and industrial cleaner. She had borrowed them from the supply closet at headquarters the evening before, telling no one, slipping out through the side entrance the way a woman with something to hide might, which was exactly what she was. A billionaire, hiding in plain sight, about to walk into the belly of her own empire and pretend she belonged to its lowest rung. She had built Grant Logistics from a single leased warehouse and a second-hand fleet of delivery vans 18 years ago. Today, the company operated across 31 states, employed over 14,000 people, and had been named one of the top 10 best workplaces in the country for 3 consecutive years. The award sat in a glass case on the 4th floor of the executive suite, polished and impressive and increasingly meaningless to her, because something was wrong. Not in the spreadsheets, the numbers looked fine. Not in the public reviews, the testimonials were glowing. But in the places where numbers and testimonials couldn't reach, something was rotting. And Isabella had spent the better part of 6 months trying to identify the source of the smell. It had started with the turnover reports. The Meridian branch, one of the company's oldest and most strategically important locations, had seen its frontline employee turnover rate climb from 11% to 34% in less than 2 years. Human resources attributed it to market competition and better-paying opportunities elsewhere. The branch director, a polished man named Clifford Reyes, had delivered a 40-slide presentation explaining the figures away with charts and regional comparisons, and the kind of corporate language that sounded authoritative until you looked at it too long. Isabella had sat in that boardroom and nodded along, and then gone home and stared at the ceiling for 3 hours, because 34% didn't feel like a market trend. It felt like people running from something. Then came the anonymous complaints. 12 of them, submitted through the company's internal ethics portal over a 4-month window. They had been flagged by the compliance team, reviewed by HR, and returned with notations that said things like insufficient specificity and unable to corroborate claim. Isabella had read each one personally, sitting alone in her office late on a Wednesday evening, with the door closed and the city going dark outside her window. They spoke of favoritism, of hostility, of a culture where frontline workers were publicly humiliated and silenced if they pushed back. They spoke of scheduling systems being manipulated, of credit being taken for work done by others, of a management team that rewarded compliance and punished honesty with a consistency that suggested design rather than accident. One complaint, filed by someone who signed themselves only as a person who just wants to do their job, described a maintenance worker being mocked in a hallway while managers watched and laughed. Another described a new hire being told, on her 3rd day, that she should avoid drawing attention to herself if she wanted to last at this location. None of the complaints named names. None of them included dates specific enough to trace. And yet they all described the same building, the same floors, the same particular quality of cruelty that Isabella recognized as the kind that festers when leadership looks the other way for long enough, that looking away has become indistinguishable from policy. She had considered launching a formal investigation. She had considered sending a team from corporate. She had considered calling Clifford Reyes into her office and watching his face while she read the complaints aloud. Instead, she had done something none of her advisors would have approved of. She had gone to the supply closet, borrowed a uniform, and decided to see for herself, not through the filtered lens of a subordinate's report, not through the bureaucratic machinery of an official inquiry, with her own eyes, her own ears, and the particular advantage of being utterly invisible to the people she was about to observe. The Meridian branch occupied a large complex on the eastern edge of the industrial district, 4 floors of warehouse and office space, connected by a central atrium that smelled perpetually of packing foam and fresh coffee. Isabella had visited it twice before, both times as herself, surrounded by staff who straightened their posture and spoke in careful, practiced sentences. She remembered the smiles. Now, walking through the side entrance with a hand truck loaded with internal supply parcels, she felt the building differently. Quieter, sharper, more honest. No one looked at her twice. A delivery worker with a hand truck was furniture. The lobby receptionist buzzed her through without making eye contact. Two managers in expensive suits walked past her in the corridor, deep in conversation, and didn't slow their stride. Isabella kept her cap pulled low and her pace steady, reading the room the way she had learned to read rooms over 20 years in business, not by looking for what people wanted her to see, but by watching what they forgot to hide. She spent the first hour routing packages to various departments, memorizing faces and learning the rhythms of the floor. By the second hour, she had identified who laughed too loudly when supervisors were nearby, who went quiet and careful when certain managers walked through, and who moved through the building with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been there long enough to become part of the architecture itself. It was during that second hour that she first saw Marcus Johnson. He was at the end of the third-floor corridor, crouching beside an air handling unit that had been making a grinding noise since early morning, according to the facilities log she had glimpsed near the elevator. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with close-cropped gray at his temples and hands that looked like they had spent decades in conversation with machines. He worked with the focused quietness of someone who didn't need an audience. He opened the unit's casing, examined the interior with a small flashlight clenched between his teeth, made 2 adjustments with a wrench he kept in the front pocket of his coveralls, and closed the panel. The grinding noise stopped. He gathered his tools, made a note in the maintenance log, clipped to his belt, and moved on. The whole thing took 11 minutes. No one in the corridor noticed. Isabella watched him for the rest of the morning. She watched him prop open a fire door for a young woman, struggling with a heavy cart before the woman could ask. She watched him spend 20 minutes helping a new hire figure out which storage bay corresponded to which routing code, drawing a small diagram on a piece of receipt paper and handing it over with the matter-of-fact patience of someone who understood that confusion was just unfamiliarity waiting for a map. She watched him eat his lunch alone in the maintenance bay, reading a paperback with a cracked spine, and then get up 15 minutes early to fix a leak under the second-floor bathroom sink that had been reported 3 days ago. He didn't announce any of this. He didn't seek credit. He simply moved through the building like a current that kept everything running without anyone noticing the current was there. She also noticed what others did to him. A manager named Garrett, who wore his authority like a cologne applied too liberally, referred to Marcus as the floor guy when giving directions to a visiting client, gesturing vaguely in his direction the way one might gesture at a piece of lobby furniture. A younger supervisor named Dana stopped Marcus in the corridor to ask why a maintenance request had taken 2 hours when she had marked it urgent, and when Marcus explained, calmly and precisely, that the parts required had needed to be sourced from the secondary supply room because the main inventory had not been restocked as scheduled, Dana cut him off with a dismissive wave and said she didn't need the whole story, just faster results. Marcus said yes, ma'am, and walked away without a trace of resentment visible on his face, which Isabella found, somehow, more striking than if he had argued back. He had worked at this branch for 18 years. She had seen that in his file. 18 years in the same building, the same role, the same quiet competence that everyone around him seemed to have collectively agreed to treat as invisible. Isabella felt something tighten in her chest. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. Something closer to grief. The grief of recognizing a particular kind of waste. The waste of a good person deposited in a context that could not see what it had. The moment that changed everything happened just before noon. In the corridor outside the third-floor conference room, Isabella was returning the hand truck to the staging area near the elevator bank when she heard voices from behind a partially closed door. She slowed instinctively, the way anyone slows when they catch a particular tone, the low, amused register of people saying things they know they shouldn't be saying out loud, but feel safe saying in what they believe is private. She recognized Garrett's voice first. He was telling a story, and the story was about Marcus. and the 4 or 5 other people in the room were laughing at the parts they were supposed to laugh at with the comfortable ease of an audience that had heard variations of this story before. Garrett described Marcus as the museum exhibits something old and outdated that nobody had gotten around to removing yet. He said, with a theatrical sigh, that it was a shame that some people peaked at pushing a mop and never had the self-awareness to realize it. Someone, a woman's voice Isabella didn't immediately recognize, added that Marcus had been passed over for every internal opportunity that had come through the building because nobody on the management team had ever seen anything in him worth investing in. Garrett agreed and said that was probably a mercy, given the man's obvious limitations. Then came the sentence that stopped Isabella's breath entirely. Garrett said, with the relaxed confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether his cruelties might have consequences, that Marcus was going to die in those coveralls, and honestly, he thought Marcus already knew it, because you could see it in his face. The room laughed. Not the nervous laugh of people who knew they'd gone too far. The comfortable, settling laugh of people who felt completely at home. Isabella stood in the corridor and did not move for what felt like a very long time. She was 42 years old, and had sat across the table from some of the most powerful and difficult people in American business. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and talked over more times than she could count. She was not easily shaken. But something about the ease of what she had just heard, the complete absence of discomfort, the laughter, the way these people had constructed an entire internal narrative about a man they saw every day and knew nothing about something. About that ease, shook her in a way that strategic memos and ethics reports had not managed to. She was still standing there when Marcus came around the corner from the stairwell, maintenance log in hand, heading toward the storage closet across from the conference room. He passed within 6 feet of the partially open door. The voices inside were still audible. His face told her he could hear them. She watched him absorb it, a very slight pause in his stride, a barely perceptible stillness in his expression. The kind of micro-adjustment a person makes when they encounter something painful and have had a great deal of practice deciding not to let it show. Then he opened the storage closet door, went inside, and closed it quietly behind him. Isabella stared at the closed door for a long moment, and in that moment, the abstract sense that something was wrong at the Meridian branch became something concrete and personal, and impossible to defer to a later date. She found him 10 minutes later in the maintenance bay, inventorying supplies. She introduced herself using the name on her borrowed ID badge and told him she was a contract worker covering a route this week. He shook her hand with the unhurried courtesy of someone who treated everyone with the same level of regard, regardless of whatever calculations others made about status and worth. She asked if he minded some company while she ate her lunch in the bay, and he said not at all, gesturing to the bench along the wall with a generosity that cost him nothing but was offered as if it were something significant. They talked about the building first, its quirks and problems, the things that needed attention, the particular personality that old structures develop over decades of use. Marcus talked about buildings, the way a physician might talk about patients, with accumulated knowledge, a kind of affection, and an eye for what wasn't functioning as it should. He described the third-floor HVAC system's tendency to overcompensate on humidity in winter, the freight elevator's preference for a specific loading weight, the way the East Wing's electrical grid flickered whenever the temperature dropped below freezing. He talked about these things not as complaints, but as the considered observations of someone who had spent 18 years in genuine relationship with a structure that most people treated as merely background. She asked him, gently and without pressure, whether he had ever considered moving on. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the space between his hands, and then he said yes, he had been approached a few times over the years. A competing logistics company had offered him a facilities director role about 6 years back, with a significant salary increase. He had thought about it seriously for about 2 weeks and then turned it down. She asked why. He thought before answering, and what he said was not what she expected. He said there were people in this building who needed someone in his position to give a genuine damn about them, and that he wasn't entirely sure they'd have that if he left. She asked what he meant by that, and he smiled a quiet, sideways smile and told her about the new hires who came in nervous and overloaded, and how he tried to make the first 3 weeks easier by helping them understand the physical space, the unwritten rhythms of the building, the things nobody put in an orientation manual. He told her about a young man who had come to him in tears 2 years ago, convinced he was about to be fired for a mistake that had turned out to be caused by a misconfigured inventory system, and how Marcus had spent his own off hours researching the system's error logs until he found the documentation that cleared the young man entirely. He had brought that documentation to the supervisor quietly and said nothing further about it, because the goal had been to solve the problem, not to be seen solving it. Isabella listened to all of this and felt the particular quality of emotion that arises when you recognize that you are in the presence of someone who is genuinely, uncomplicatedly good, not performatively good, not strategically good, but good the way a load-bearing wall is good, without fanfare, without the expectation of recognition, simply by virtue of holding up what needs to be held up. She finished her lunch, thanked him for the conversation, and went back to her route. But she spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about him, and that evening, instead of returning to her hotel, she went to the branch's records office and asked to review the historical files. It took her 2 hours to find what she was looking for, because it was buried not deliberately, she suspected, but through the particular bureaucratic amnesia that causes important things to disappear into filing systems nobody ever revisits. The records office was a narrow room on the building's lower level, lined with filing cabinets and stacked binders, the kind of space that accumulated the institutional memory of an organization and then made that memory as difficult as possible to access. She worked through the older folders methodically, starting with the year Marcus had joined, and moving forward, scanning incident logs and maintenance records and the various categories of documentation that a facility of this size generated in the ordinary course of its operations. The incident had occurred 18 years ago, 8 months after Marcus had joined the company. A fire in the main receiving warehouse, started by an electrical fault in a storage unit on the ground floor. The fire had broken out at 11:15 at night during a late shift, and the building's evacuation system had partially failed. The alarm on the south end of the warehouse had not activated properly, leaving a crew of 7 workers isolated in a section they didn't realize was filling with smoke. Marcus had already evacuated with the first group. He had gone back in twice. He had guided 4 workers out on his first re-entry and 3 more on his second, navigating a smoke-filled building in the dark with no breathing equipment and nothing to orient himself by, except 18 months of physical familiarity with the warehouse layout, the position of every door, every corridor junction, every emergency exit that the building's architects had embedded in the structure, and that Marcus had committed to memory in the way of someone who understood instinctively that a building holds secrets worth knowing. By the time the last person was out, the roof of the south section had partially collapsed. He had been treated for smoke inhalation at the hospital and released the following morning. He had returned to work 2 days later. The incident report was thorough and clinical. It described the fire, the evacuation, the failure of the alarm system, and the subsequent repair. It named Marcus Johnson in a single sentence near the end. Employee M. Johnson assisted in the evacuation of 7 personnel from the affected area before emergency services arrived. One sentence, buried on the 4th page of a 40-page report that had likely not been reviewed by anyone in a leadership position since the year it was filed. Isabella sat in the records room and read that sentence 3 times. Then she sat in silence for a long while. She thought about what it meant that a man who had run into a burning building twice, without equipment, without anyone asking him, to a man who had directly prevented what would almost certainly have been the closure of this entire branch, had spent 18 years in the same building, in the same role, being called the floor guy, by people who had not been present on the night he made their careers possible. She thought about what it said about the organization she had built, that this fact was contained in an unsearched file in a records room rather than in the institutional memory of anyone currently in a position of authority. She thought about the single sentence on page 4. She went back to her hotel and did not sleep. The next morning she arrived early and spent the hours before the management team convened reviewing everything she could access remotely, from her secured corporate account emails, performance reviews, HR records, financial reports, facilities logs. What she found in those files confirmed and deepened what she had already begun to suspect. Garrett and two other senior managers had been systematically manipulating performance metrics for their department, attributing the output of frontline workers to their own oversight records, and allocating credit for process improvements that had originated from hourly employees without acknowledgement. There was a pattern of scheduling manipulation workers being assigned extra hours without proper overtime classification, then having the hours retroactively altered in the system to avoid the paper trail. There were performance review records in which workers who had filed internal complaints subsequently received lower ratings, all documented through the same HR system that was supposed to protect them from exactly this kind of retaliation. And there was Marcus. His name appeared in 7 separate disciplinary recommendation files over the past 3 years, not because he had been disciplined, but because someone had been building a case. The recommendations were thin and transparently pretextual. A maintenance log submitted 5 minutes late, a supply requisition form filled out in the wrong sequence, a minor communication protocol violation that amounted to responding to an email with insufficient formality. None of them, individually, would have been sufficient grounds for termination. Collectively, they represented exactly the kind of cumulative paper trail a manager constructs when the goal is not to address a legitimate performance issue, but to create documentation sufficient to justify removing someone who has become inconvenient. She understood now why he had become a target. He knew too much. Not in the conspiratorial sense he wasn't a whistleblower, didn't have evidence cached somewhere, wasn't preparing to expose anyone. He knew too much in the simpler sense that someone who has spent 18 years in a building and pays genuine attention to what happens there accumulates an inconvenient depth of institutional knowledge. He had observed the gap between how things were reported and how they actually functioned. He had, on more than one occasion, quietly pointed out discrepancies to supervisors who had not thanked him for it. And unlike newer employees who might be managed through uncertainty and fear, he was difficult to intimidate because he was not afraid of losing a job he had already been offered better versions of and had chosen not to take. They had decided to remove him. The mechanism they had chosen was a disciplinary hearing scheduled for that Thursday, at which they intended to present the accumulated documentation and recommend immediate termination on grounds of repeated non-compliance with operational procedure. Isabella found the meeting notice in the calendar system. She looked at the time. She looked at the attendee list. Then she made several phone calls, sent several emails, and arranged for certain documents to be prepared and certain technical resources to be available at a specific time on Thursday morning. She told no one what she was planning. She put her delivery uniform back on and went back to work. She used the 2 remaining days to continue observing. What she saw did not surprise her, but it clarified things in ways that the files alone could not. She saw how the tone set by Garrett and his peers filtered down through the organization, how younger supervisors mimicked the dismissive register, how frontline workers who had originally joined the company with evident enthusiasm had learned to reduce themselves, to take up less space, to make no demands, and offer no ideas, because the environment had trained them to understand that visible competence was not rewarded here, that standing out meant becoming a target, that the safest strategy was invisibility. She saw how Marcus moved against this current, not through confrontation, but through consistency, a consistent decency that the environment could not completely extinguish because it was not dependent on the environment for its fuel. On the morning of the disciplinary hearing, Isabella arrived at the building before 6 and spent an hour in the records room confirming that everything she needed was accessible. At 9:50, she took the elevator to the 4th floor and positioned herself near the back of the large conference room where the hearing was scheduled. Her delivery cap pulled down, her hand truck parked against the wall. The room filled gradually with members of the management team, 4 of whom were directly implicated in what she had found, 2 of whom seemed to have been called as witnesses without a full understanding of what they were being asked to witness to. Marcus arrived last, escorted by a junior HR coordinator who appeared deeply uncomfortable with the proceedings she had been assigned to administer. He sat in the chair that had been arranged in the center of the room facing the management table, with the particular stillness of a man who had made a prior and private decision about how he intended to conduct himself, regardless of what happened around him. Garrett opened the proceedings with the polished formality of someone who had done this before and found it satisfying. He presented the documentation, the sequence of technical violations, the performance flags, the incident reports. He spoke about standards and accountability and the importance of professional conduct in a way that would have sounded reasonable to anyone without the context that Isabella now possessed. Marcus listened without interrupting. When given the opportunity to respond, he did so in measured, specific terms, addressing each item on its own merits, identifying the factual inaccuracies and the contextual distortions with a precision that clearly unsettled some of the people at the management table, even as Garrett continued to project impassive authority. At 10:47, Garrett announced that based on the documented evidence, the management team's recommendation was immediate termination, effective at the end of the business day. He asked the HR coordinator to begin preparing the relevant paperwork. Isabella set down her hand truck and walked to the front of the room. There was a moment of collective confusion, the way a room full of people reacts when something happens that doesn't fit any of the categories they were prepared for. A delivery worker had walked to the front of a management meeting. Garrett's expression moved through irritation to contempt to something more uncertain as she turned and faced the room. She reached up and took off her baseball cap. She said, calmly and without preliminary, that she needed everyone to remain in their seats. Garrett began to speak. She held up one hand and said his name, just his name, with a particular quality of finality that caused him to stop mid-sentence and remain stopped. She turned to the room's presentation screen, where a connection she had arranged beforehand was waiting, and opened the first file. What followed was 32 minutes that none of the people in that room would forget for the rest of their professional lives. She walked through the evidence methodically, not theatrically, not with the accumulated anger of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to unleash it, but with the measured precision of someone who had built a career on understanding that clarity is more powerful than volume. She presented the performance metric manipulations. She presented the overtime falsifications. She presented the email threads in which Garrett and two colleagues had explicitly discussed strategies for removing Marcus from the building using pretextual disciplinary processes. She played a 40-second audio clip, recorded automatically by the building's security system during a maintenance call, in which Garrett's voice described Marcus using language that Isabella did not read aloud, but allowed the room to hear for itself. The room went very still, in a way that a room full of people goes still when they realize they have all heard the same thing, and there is no version of what happens next in which that thing is unheard. She presented the incident report from 18 years ago. She displayed the single sentence on the screen and let it sit there for a moment before she spoke again. She said that the man currently seated in the center of this room had run into a burning building twice without being asked to, had guided 7 people out of a smoke-filled warehouse in the dark without breathing equipment, and had returned to work 2 days after being treated for smoke inhalation, and that the sum total of the organization's formal acknowledgement of that fact was one sentence on page 4 of a report filed in a system nobody reviewed. She said that she intended to discuss at length what that said about the organization's values and whether those values were consistent with what the organization claimed to be. But first, she wanted to address the matter that had brought everyone into this room. She turned to Marcus and told him that the disciplinary proceeding was closed, that the recommendations in his file had been reviewed at the highest organizational level and found to be without merit, and that his employment record would be expunged of the documentation that had been accumulated against him. She told him she was sorry plainly, without corporate qualification, sorry that this building had failed to recognize what it had in him, and sorry that she had not found her way to this floor sooner. Then she turned back to the management table and told Garrett and the 2 colleagues most directly implicated that they were suspended effective immediately, pending the completion of a formal investigation that she would personally oversee. She told the remaining managers that they would receive notices regarding mandatory review meetings in the coming week. She asked the HR coordinator, who had gone very still during the 32 minutes, and was now looking at Isabella with an expression of stunned relief to please begin processing the relevant suspension paperwork and to ensure that Marcus received a copy of the formal closure documentation before the end of the day. Then she picked up her baseball cap, tucked it under her arm, and waited while the room processed what had just happened. Garrett left first. He did so without speaking, which was perhaps the wisest decision he had made in a long time. The others followed in various states of shock. The way people exit a room when they are simultaneously trying to process an enormous amount of information and determine whether there is anything they can do to affect outcomes that have already been determined. Within 7 minutes, only Isabella, Marcus, and the HR coordinator remained. Marcus was looking at her, not with the expression of someone who had just been rescued. She noticed that specifically and was grateful for it. The look she had half expected and half dreaded was the look of a man absorbing an unexpected reversal of fortune, calculating what it meant and what came next. That was not what she saw. He was looking at her with the thoughtful, slightly removed expression of someone who has just witnessed something they find genuinely interesting and is taking a moment to properly consider what it means before saying anything about it. There was no performance in his face. There was no gratitude performed for the audience of one remaining in the room, no visible recalibration to suit what he might now imagine she wanted from him. He was simply looking at her the way he looked at everything, the way he looked at a malfunctioning HVAC unit, or a new hire struggling with an unfamiliar system, or the pages of a paperback he was reading alone in the maintenance bay at lunch, with genuine, unmediated attention. He said, after a quiet moment that she didn't try to fill, that he wasn't sure what he had expected this week to become, but that this wasn't it. She told him she wasn't entirely sure either. He smiled at that, a real smile, not the careful social maintenance smile she had observed him deploying throughout the week in corridors and meetings, but the kind that reaches into a person's eyes and suggests they find something genuinely worth being amused by. She returned it, and for a moment, the enormous distance between their respective positions in the organization collapsed to nothing, and they were simply two people who had just been through something unusual together and were still working out what to make of it. The weeks that followed were not simple. A formal investigation of the scope that the Meridian Branch's situation required never is. There were interviews, document reviews, findings reports, legal consultations, and the particular kind of organizational reckoning that occurs when leadership discovers that the culture it believed it had built is measurably different from the culture that had actually been operating. 3 of the implicated managers accepted separation agreements. One contested the findings and was ultimately not successful in that contest. New leadership was installed, not parachuted in from corporate, but identified carefully with the explicit criteria that candidates should demonstrate track records of creating environments in which the people with the least formal power felt most able to speak freely and without fear of the consequences of honesty. Isabella returned to corporate and spent a week in her office doing the kind of thinking she had been avoiding. She reviewed the ethics portal complaints she had seen 6 months earlier and thought about what it would have meant to act on them sooner, not in the self-flagellating sense, but in the genuinely practical sense of mapping the distance between the information she had received and the action that information should have generated, and understanding exactly where that distance had opened up. She thought about the systems she had built, the reporting structures, the performance frameworks, the feedback mechanisms, and asked herself honestly whether those systems had been designed to surface truth or to surface confirmation. The difference between those two things was not subtle, she had come to understand. A system designed to surface confirmation produces beautiful quarterly reports and ethics portals full of complaints that get marked insufficient specificity. A system designed to surface truth produces discomfort and contradiction, and findings that require you to change things you had assumed were working. She had built, in large measure, the first kind of system. She intended to build more of the second. She made significant changes to several of those systems. She also established a new internal recognition protocol, not an awards program with ceremonies and certificates, but a quiet, regular process by which people at every level of the organization could be formally identified and acknowledged for contributions that the standard performance metrics were not designed to capture. Marcus Johnson was among the first people formally recognized under that protocol. But long before that recognition was formalized, Isabella had asked him to meet her in the branch director's office for what she described simply as a conversation. He came in his coveralls because his shift started in an hour, and sat across from her with the same unhurried attentiveness he brought to everything. She told him what she had found in the files: the fire, the 7 workers, the single sentence. She told him she wanted to understand why he had never said anything, never brought it forward, never used it, and there were clear moments over the years when it would have been relevant to use it as leverage. He took a moment before he answered, in the particular way of a person who gives weight to what they're about to say rather than defaulting to the first available version of it. He said that he hadn't done what he did that night because he wanted something for it. He'd done it because there were people in that building who needed someone to go back in, and he was the one who happened to know the building well enough to do it. He said that asking to be compensated for that afterward had never felt right to him, that it would have changed. In some way he found difficult to articulate precisely what the act had been. If he'd gone back in with one eye on what it might earn him later, it would have been a different kind of act. He had gone back in because the situation was what it was, and he was who he was, and those two things together had pointed clearly in one direction. He said, with the slight smile she was beginning to associate with his most honest observations, that he understood some people would call that naive, and maybe they were right, but it was how he was built, and he had stopped arguing with his own construction a long time ago. She asked him then the question she had been carrying since the afternoon she had first watched him in the corridor: why he had stayed. Not why he hadn't left when the competing company offered him the director role. Why he had stayed through 18 years of being called the floor guy, being talked about behind closed doors in ways she now knew he could hear, being documented against in files. He could see we're building towards something. He was quiet for longer this time. He looked at his hands. Those large, careful hands that knew every mechanical system in the building, by feel, and seemed to be finding the words, not in his head but somewhere more fundamental, somewhere in the part of a person that exists before language. And then he said something she would return to for a long time afterward. He said that there had always been people in this building who treated him right. Not loudly, not in ways that canceled out everything else, but genuinely. A dispatcher named Ruth who had brought him coffee every morning for 9 years and never once failed to ask how his mother was doing. His mother, who had been ill for 3 of those years and had recovered, and who Ruth had asked about consistently through all of it, not as a social formality, but as a person who actually wanted to know. A young woman, in receiving, who had cried on his shoulder the week her father died, and who had 2 years later been promoted to a role she had told him she would never have had the confidence to apply for if he hadn't encouraged her to believe she was ready. A facilities trainee who had come to him dyslexic and terrified of the written reporting requirements, and whom Marcus had helped develop a personal system for documentation that worked around the difficulty rather than against it. He said that these people, and others like them, were the actual fabric of the place, not the managers, not the metrics, the people who showed up every day and tried to do their jobs with decency. He said he had felt responsible for them. He said that was, in the end, the simplest way he could explain it. 1 month after the disciplinary hearing, the Meridian branch had a new director, new management protocols, and a newly created role that had not previously existed in the company's organizational structure. The role was titled Internal Culture Advisor, and it was offered to Marcus Johnson. The title came with a compensation adjustment that finally reflected 18 years of genuine institutional value, and it came with a scope working directly with frontline teams, identifying structural barriers to respectful workplace culture, participating in the orientation of new management personnel that had been designed around what Marcus already did, quietly and without compensation, as a function of who he was, rather than what his job description required. He accepted after asking to review the role description carefully and suggesting 2 modifications, both of which were incorporated without discussion, because Isabella had learned enough by then to understand that when Marcus Johnson had a suggestion about how something should work, the correct response was to take it seriously and act on it. The announcement of his appointment was made to the branch staff in a simple all-hands meeting, without ceremony or extended narrative. Isabella attended. She stood at the back and watched the room. Several people looked genuinely relieved. The particular relief of people who have been hoping for something for a long time and had started to doubt whether it would arrive. A few people cried, quietly, in the way of people who are managing a feeling that has been waiting longer than they realized. The dispatcher, Ruth, who had brought Marcus coffee every morning for 9 years, started applauding before the announcement was fully finished, and she was not the only one. The applause spread through the room with the organic quality of something that doesn't need prompting, that arises from somewhere more genuine than social obligation. After the meeting, as the staff dispersed and the room was emptying, Isabella crossed to where Marcus was standing and shook his hand. She told him that if he ever encountered anything, any policy, any personnel issue, any structural problem that he felt needed to reach her directly, he should contact her directly, without going through any intermediary, and that the line would be open without condition or qualification. He nodded and said he understood and that he was grateful. Then, because he was the kind of person who said the thing that was actually true rather than the thing that was expected of him, he said that he hoped she wouldn't take this wrong, but that he also hoped she never had to wear the delivery uniform again. She laughed an unexpected laugh, the full kind, the kind she hadn't produced in a board meeting in longer than she could remember. She told him she couldn't make any promises. She drove back to the city that evening, thinking about a question she had been asking herself since the night in the records room, the night she had read the incident report and found the single sentence and sat in the silence afterward. The question was about the sentence itself, about who had decided that one sentence was the appropriate quantity of acknowledgement for what Marcus Johnson had done on that night 18 years ago. She suspected the answer was that no single person had decided it, that it was the product of a system that had never been asked to measure what he represented, because the system had not been built to value what he represented, which meant the problem was not Garrett. Garrett was a symptom. The problem was a system she had built and presided over, a culture that had created the conditions in which a man like Marcus could spend nearly 2 decades being reduced to one sentence on page 4 of a document no one ever revisited. That was the harder question, not what to do about the bad actors. That part, while painful, had been straightforward. The harder question was what to build in place of the structures that had produced them. On a morning 6 weeks later, Isabella stood at the window of her office on the executive floor and watched the city spread out below her, the logistics network she could trace in her mind, like a map she had memorized over 2 decades, the warehouses and the routes, and the thousands of people whose working lives were in some measure shaped by decisions made in buildings like this one. She thought about Marcus in the Meridian branch, doing some version of what he had always done, paying attention, helping someone, noticing what needed to be noticed, being the quiet current that kept things running. She thought about Ruth and her morning coffee. She thought about the young woman who had been encouraged to believe she was ready for a promotion and had gotten it. She thought about the trainee with dyslexia and the personal documentation system they had built together over patient, unhurried evenings. She thought about the 7 people who had walked out of a burning building 18 years ago because one man had gone back in, and about the families those people had gone home to, and about all the ordinary days those families had lived because of something Marcus had done and never once mentioned again. All of that was invisible on a balance sheet. None of it appeared in an annual report. The awards in the glass case on the 4th floor of the executive suite had been given by organizations that had measured something real but insufficient, the surface of a culture rather than its foundation. The foundation was people like Marcus, always had been. The most valuable thing in any organization was never the assets on a balance sheet or the contracts in a filing cabinet or the square footage of warehouse space. It was the character of the people who showed up every day and chose to care, chose it deliberately, without guarantee of recognition, without the safety of knowing that care would be returned. And the most important job of anyone who ran such an organization was to see those people, truly see them before it took a fire, or a borrowed uniform, or a recording played in a room full of people who had run out of places to hide to make the seeing possible. She had learned that at 42, which was later than she would have preferred and earlier than it might have been. She intended not to forget it. Some lessons arrive too late to be useful. This one, she had decided, had arrived exactly when it needed to, and the man who had taught it to her was 3 floors below, in a building that finally knew his name.